Hey y'all, today we're going to talk about breaking the cycle of depression. Now, the trickiest thing about depression as a clinician dealing with it is that one problem leads to another problem. Depression is almost like the HIV/AIDS of mental illness because it attacks your very ability to fight back. So once you feel depressed, it's hard to get out of bed, it's hard to get motivated. And then once it's hard to get motivated, other parts of your life start to fall apart. And so this creates a vicious cycle. And it turns out that there's one central point which can actually disarm the cycle, which is our ability of perception, or more specifically, how depression creates particular cognitive biases that then make our life worse. Before we dive into the details, I just wanted to tell y'all a little bit about myself. So I'm someone who studied for 7 years to become a monk and then ended up becoming a psychiatrist. If y'all are interested in more resources on depression, check out the various videos on our YouTube channel, our resource packs, or even check out Dr. K's guide, which is sort of my take on depression. How do I approach patients when they walk into my office? How do I sort of figure out what's clinical and what's non-clinical? And today we're going to be sharing with you a non-clinical perspective on depression, which is the kind of stuff that's included in the guide. So let's go back to this idea of perception. So before we kind of get into why perception is so important, let's take a quick look at the cycle of depression. So what do we know scientifically about what happens to someone when they become depressed? So it starts with an inciting event, okay? So what we know scientifically is that most people who get depressed usually start with something bad. So there's some kind of normal bad thing that happens in life. There's a breakup, we lose a loved one, we sort of get an F on a test. Something happens, and then the first thing is that many people recover from it. But if you end up with depression, something happens and you don't recover from it. And let's understand a little bit about what that cycle is. So when there's an inciting event, the first thing that happens is that there's a cognitive bias that occurs. And so the problem with the cognitive bias is it shapes the way that we see the world. We start to see it in a negative manner. And so even though things are objectively better than we think they are, our mind doesn't see it that way. Now, before we kind of get further into it, we're going to show y'all a cool experiment that shows you how your mind, when it doesn't know something, will just make things up. So it's a really great experiment, which is that most people don't realize that you actually have blind spots in both of your eyes. I know right now you're looking at the world and you think that you can see everything in front of you, but you literally cannot. There's actually a part of your vision that is a blind spot where you can't see anything. And it turns out that your mind constructs almost like an AI what should be there. So we're going to start by showing you this principle. So what I want y'all to do is sit up straight, close your left eye, and then hold your left finger out in front of you kind of like this, okay? So we want to hold our left finger, and then we're going to be looking at our left finger with our right eye. And then I want you to put your two fingers together, so focus on the left finger, the opposite finger from the eye. And then what I want y'all to do is move the right finger slowly away. So as you focus on this finger, what you'll notice is there's a period right about here where you actually cannot see this finger. You can even wiggle it around a little bit and you'll notice that it's completely gone. And if you move to the left, you can see it. If you move to the right, you can see it, but there's actually a blind spot right here. And this is absolutely insane because it teaches us one very simple principle, which is that when the mind doesn't actually have information, it makes shit up. And this is a huge problem in depression. So let's go back to this idea of an inciting event. So once we have an inciting event, there's a set of cognitive biases that start to come into play. So let's talk about what these are. The first is negative interpretation of ambiguous events. Okay? So what this means is that let's say you're in the break room and a colleague of yours is in the break room and they don't say hi to you while they're grabbing their coffee and you're grabbing your coffee. So if your mind is depressed, it's going to take this ambiguous information and interpret it in the most negative way possible. But it's not that the person dislikes you, it's that your mind is doing this business again, where it doesn't actually see what's going on, but it fills it in with whatever the depressive character of your mind is. So this is bias number one. And we'll talk a little bit about how to deal with these. So bias number two is a selection bias towards the negative. Now, what does this mean? So I'm sure that y'all have been in this kind of situation where someone has given you feedback and they give you positive feedback and they give you negative feedback. But sometimes our mind is kind of tricky and it actually ignores all of the positive feedback. And then it sort of narrows down or focuses entirely on the negative feedback. The third bias that we create, this one is so tricky, it's so subtle and so devastating, is an over-generalization of memories. Okay, now this is really important to understand. It's subtle, but it's important to understand. So when your mind is healthy, it remembers specifics. So if my mind is healthy and let's say I get a performance review where I get good feedback and negative feedback, what the mind will naturally do if I'm healthy is I'll say, okay, I'm doing these things good and I'm doing these things poorly. But if I am depressed, what starts to happen is I overgeneralize, especially my memories. So what ends up happening is the next day, all I will remember is that performance review went terribly. Even though my boss said, hey, you're doing a fantastic job, but I tend to ignore that. So I tend to overgeneralize. And if you talk to people who are depressed, or maybe you've been this way, maybe you're depressed, you'll sort of notice that they speak in very general terms. My life sucks. The world is going to hell. Everything sucks. Everything sucks. Everything sucks. And if you ask them for specifics, they can give you specifics. And we'll get to that in a second. But there is still this function at play in the brain where their brain is sort of overgeneralizing things and removing a lot of positivity. So let's take a quick look at how this manifests very practically. So if I am going through a day, let's say I get one positive event, one negative event, and one neutral event. So let's say I go to work and I actually had a good performance review. My boss said, you did a fantastic job. Here are a couple of things you need to work on. This is a good thing. My boss said I did a fantastic job. Then there's the neutral event. There's the person who is grabbing coffee in the morning who doesn't say hi. And then I get a text from someone that I've been on 3 dates with saying, I don't think this is going to work. If I'm a non-depressed person, if my mind isn't depressed, on this day, I had one piece of bad news, one piece of good news, and then all kinds of stuff happened in my day, not just this, all kinds of stuff happened in my day that's relatively neutral, right? Some people said hi, some people didn't say hi. But if I am depressed, what ends up happening? First of all, this gets removed from my memory. I literally do not think about it. The neutral thing gets converted to a negative thing, and then I have a negative thing. So whereas on balance, I actually had a +1, a 0, and a -1. In the mind of a depressed person, I have a 0, a -1, and a -1. So in my life, instead of even breaking even, I convert breaking even into a -2. So what tends to happen next? So now as I start to see the world like this, the world becomes objectively worse, right? Because like my mind cannot see the positive information. And let's take a look at what this looks like. So now I decide that I'm bad at my job, or my job sucks. People don't like me. I'll be alone forever. So if we sort of look at this for a second, we begin to realize that in people who are depressed's lives, everything feels like it's going wrong, right? This thing is going wrong, and this thing is going wrong, and this thing is going wrong. Everything's going wrong at the same time. And so if you have problems at your job, if you have problems with your friendships, and if you have problems with your romantic relationships, what does the mind end up concluding? If every dimension of your life is going wrong, is it really every dimension of life that's the problem? No. Then our mind puts all these three things together and concludes, I am bad. And this, by the way, is the crux of something called negative self-attitude. So the key hallmark of depression is a negative self-attitude. The way that you see yourself is incredibly negative. And how do we get to see ourselves as incredibly negative? It's because of this, right? I suck at this, I suck at this, I suck at this. But this, in turn, is based on a perception problem. So then what happens is once I have negative self-attitude, then we enter all the good science about depression, right? Then what I start to do is I start to have problems with motivation. I start to have problems with inflammation. Now, as I have negative self-attitude, my serotonin level maybe decreases. And so then we enter into treatment. Now, here's the problem with treatment, is that when we're treating someone with depression, there's a lot of things we can do as psychiatrists or therapists. We can help people cognitively reframe. We can help validate their emotions. We can work on the emotional part of the brain. We can work on the cognitive part of the brain. But this is what's the big thing that's missing. What perpetuates the cycle is actually the perception problem, right? Because it's not that actually three things in your life went wrong. It's only that one thing in your life went wrong, but you're unable to see it that way. And the reason that, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but the reason that psychiatrists suck at altering your perception is because that is literally the one thing that we cannot do, right? So as a psychiatrist, I can talk to you about your emotions. I can validate your emotions. I can decompress your emotions. I can give you a hug. I can tell you I think you're a wonderful human being. I can do all this kind of stuff. We can also do things like cognitive behavioral therapy. We're gonna make charts. What are your cognitions? What are your behaviors? What are your emotions? We can do all this stuff because it involves words, right? It involves actions. But the one thing that we can't change is the way that you see the world. And so the problem with this now is that since we aren't good at it as psychiatrists, we actually don't have interventions for it because it's something that happens within you. And since we don't have sort of interventions for it, what this means is that this one part of the cycle of depression has been horribly neglected by the field of psychiatry. And the real problem here is that this one part of your brain that's been horribly neglected is actually the most important part for propagating the cycle of depression. It's the thing that actually happens the earliest. And even if you look at people who are resilient, so if you do studies on people, if you look at studies of people who are resilient, what you discover is that the way that they perceive setbacks is different from people who are not resilient. It all comes down to a perception difference. So people who are resilient will say, okay, this thing, I didn't do great today, but I learned something, right? So like, at least I'll be better tomorrow. So the way that they interpret their events is very different. Hey, y'all, if you're interested in applying some of the principles that we share to actually create change in your life, check out Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. It combines over 2 decades of my experience of both being a monk and a psychiatrist and distills all of the most important things I've learned into a choose-your-own-adventure format. So check out the link in the bio and start your journey today. So what do we do about this? There are a couple of things that we're going to use from the system of yoga. And the reason that I love the system of yoga is because it is strong at everything that psychotherapy is weak at. Because psychotherapy is about, I'm going to do something to you, right? You're going to come into my office, I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to therapize you. But in yoga, it's all about a single person, right? So there's no one there to help you. You're sitting there, you're meditating. And so the other cool thing about yoga is it's very good at training perception. They have a whole system of meditation called pratyahara, which is all about training your perception. There are dozens of practices. This is also in the guide, by the way. So here's what we're going to teach you. We're going to teach you one very simple thing, which is called the mentality materiality exercise. This exercise comes from this awesome Buddhist text called the Vishuddhimagga. And the Vishuddhimagga literally means the path of purification. So this is the way that you purify different parts of yourself. And they have a beautiful part in there. They have a beautiful chapter in there about purifying your perception. And what they share with us is something called the mentality materiality exercise. It's very verbose. That's just how they talk. So this exercise is actually quite simple. It is to acknowledge that anything that you see in the world has a materiality to it. So here I've got a vial of, I think, a sample perfume. Okay. So if I look at this, there are some attributes of this that come from the vial, right? So this vial it's clear, it's white, it's kind of like a little bit cold, it's not very heavy, it's light. All of these things are actually in the object. The question is that when I see this object, I do not see it that way, right? What I see is, oh, I like this perfume, I don't like this perfume, it's too small, man, I should have bought a bigger bottle because I really liked it, and now I can't find it online, and now this is a problem. That's all true, by the way. This is something that I was going to get for my wife that I didn't order in time because I procrastinated, and now I still have this thing. It's been sitting on my desk for a year. So the key thing here is that if you look at the world, let's say you see your dog has certain physical material attributes. It's hairy, it's smelly, it has a cute face, but even cuteness, right? So what is cuteness? Cuteness is something that our mind attaches to the dog. And this is the point of the mentality materiality exercise, is to notice what are all of the things that are actually a part of the object and what are all of the things that my mind adds to it. And what you will discover is mind-blowing because 99% of your perception doesn't actually come from the outside world. It actually comes from you. So when you look at your dog and your dog makes you feel good, the making you feel good is not in the fur of the dog. It's not in the eyes of the dog. It's not in the wagging tail of the dog. This is just a dog sitting there wagging its tail. What makes you feel good comes from within you. And this is also where, if we sort of stop and think about it, a lot of what we get upset about, this person did not say hi to me in the break room this morning. Hold on a second. What does your mind attach? What is the mentality that you attach to that materiality? The materiality is I walked into the break room, I got my coffee, they got their coffee, they walked out, and I walked out. That is all that happened. That's it. And yet our mind attaches all kinds of meaning to this. And then you may say, but my mind attaches meaning because it's logical, right? Because it knows that I am unliked. And now we get to the second thing that we're going to talk about. So just practice the mentality materiality thing, where I want you all to just notice your internal reactions and what you attach to objects outside of you. And this is where in the Vishuddhimagga they talk about 40 attributes of materiality. So they say that an object can be hard, it can be soft, it can be heavy, it can be light, it can be warm, it can be cold, it can have temperature, it can have smoothness, it can have whatever. So they attach all these different attributes, and none of them are going to be the stuff that your mind attaches. To like something or dislike something, something's good or something is bad. These are all attached by your mind. So do that practice. There are a couple of other things that we can manage to shape our perception, and that's going to be these three sources of cognitive bias. So the next exercise that you can do, if you feel like the world is going to hell, is you can let's start with the interpretation of ambiguous stimuli. So there are studies that basically show, like conclusively, that people who are depressed will see ambiguous things and interpret them in the worst ways possible. So, for example, there's one study that showed that if you have a neutral facial expression, right, you're just like, depressed people will see that as negative, and normal people will see that as neutral. This person is just like walking. They must be thinking about whatever, right? That it has nothing to do with me. We'll get to that one in a second. So what you want to do is take anything that you sort of view as negative and take a sheet of paper and say, what is the real evidence that you have that this is a negative thing? And what is the evidence that you have to the contrary? This technique is also used in cognitive behavioral therapy. So you take one thing that is negative and you try to see what could be positive there. And the goal isn't that you have to believe that. The goal is literally to practice having your mind look at things in a more nuanced way. We want to be able to weigh pros and cons, but in depression, all we see is the cons. So as we do this practice, this will actually work for number 1 and number 2 with the selection bias. That's very, very, very hard to shape, but the mentality materiality exercise will help with. And let's talk about how for a second. So why does the mentality materiality exercise help with selection bias? So as we begin to see things as they are instead of our way of interpreting them, this will change the way that we see the world. So then we won't select just the negative because nothing in our life is going to be negative. Everything is actually going to be neutral. And this is the goal that even the Dalai Lama speaks of. So he says the hardest thing to do in the world is to see things as they are. So mentality materiality is going to help with our selection bias. We talked about altering our interpretations with a pro-cons list. And now we get to the good one, over-generalization. So there's one thing you can do to break the cycle of over-generalization, which is to remove I from the equation. So if you look at someone who's depressed, one of the key things is that they always think that they're at fault, right? So, and this is going to sound really weird because if you pay attention to your thoughts and you're depressed or you're feeling bad, we're not talking about clinical depression. We're just talking about you're kind of in a bad headspace. What you'll find is everything has to do with you. These people would be better off without me. They'd have more fun if I didn't even go. The work, everyone would be happier at work. Everything is about me, 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 me. So what we know about depression is it's actually quite narcissistic in some ways. We even know that the part of your brain that thinks about you is hyperactive in depression. This is the part of the brain called the default mode network. And this is also why ketamine is one of the fastest or is the fastest treatment for depression that we know of. And what ketamine actually does, you can infuse ketamine or give it to people intranasally. And what ketamine does is causes a dissociative reaction in your brain. So ketamine causes dissociation. That's why we initially used it for anesthesia and surgery. So we give people ketamine and then they lose sight of themselves. And once they lose sight of themselves, nothing hurts. So we literally induce dissociation and it breaks the cycle of depression. So we're going to do that without ketamine because ketamine has all kinds of problems. And so this is what we're going to practice is removing the I from your thinking, right? So what you'll notice is that Overgeneralized thinking has to do with I thinking. I know this is getting kind of like nuanced, but I really want y'all to hear what I'm saying. So anytime you overgeneralize, it's going to involve I. You'll see that these two thoughts are linked. I suck, right? That is the mother of all overgeneralizations. And so what we want to start doing is literally thinking about particular scenarios, like I went into the break room and I got my coffee and this person got their coffee. And what we end up doing is we think that the reason they didn't talk to us is because they don't like me. We never stop to think, okay, maybe this person is going through a divorce. Maybe this person is preoccupied. Maybe this person has a really stressful day. Maybe this person is really excited about something. Maybe this person just got a really worrying text. We do not think about the other person at all. It always has to do with me, 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 me. So pay attention to any thoughts that you have in your mind that are overgeneralized and have to do with you. And just take a moment to consider, what about the rest of the world? What could be going on in this person's life to create this behavior? And sometimes people can get so depressed that they literally cannot think of anything. And that's why I encourage y'all to practice as best as you can. And this is the kind of thing, by the way, this cognitive reframing is something that a therapist can really help you with. The last thing that I'm going to share with y'all is something called the thematic apperception test. So what we do with the thematic apperception test is we look at images that are intentionally ambiguous. And then we ask people for their interpretation of them. So as we look at this, like you may say like, oh, it's very clear what's going on. This person is really sad. But the question is, why are they sad? Did someone just die here? That's my interpretation of this one. What about this? Right? Like this is kind of creepy. The other reason I like the thematic apperception test is all the images are like super creepy. So this is like a good example of like what's going on here. Like, how are you interpreting this? Is this person trying to smother this person, or is this a blessing that they're giving, or like, what are they doing here? Are they about to wake them up? Like, who knows? What about this one? So the key thing here is that some of these images can be interpreted very, very differently because the image is purposefully ambiguous. And the whole point of the thematic apperception test is that we don't realize how much our perception shapes literally the way that we see the world. We think of our perception as objective. And the problem is, until we start questioning our perception, then the cycle of depression will continue, because the inputs we're getting that are making us depressed are not actually accurate. They are distorted in some way. And since they're distorted, we see the world in a negative light. Then we draw conclusions about the world. Our mind loves to overgeneralize. Then we draw conclusions about ourselves. And then once we believe that we are not good, then all kinds of problems will arise. So the question is, how do you short circuit this? The way you short circuit it is by actually training your perception, right? So if we can look out for these cognitive biases, the selection bias, the interpretation of ambiguity as negative, and the overgeneralization, it will change literally the way that you see the world. And once the world becomes a different place, it is way easier to be less depressed. Now, there's one last thing that, in all fairness, I have to include. I didn't want to include it, but I kind of got to. So the last thing we got to talk about is actually kind of derails what I just told y'all. So there's this great concept called depressive realism. And what basically researchers were trying to figure out is that if I am depressed, or does a depressed person actually see the world in a distorted way, or do they see it in a realistic way? So is the glass literally half empty? And what we've discovered is kind of scary, is that depressed people are better at actually judging the accuracy of the world. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but hear me out. So all human beings have an inherent bias towards the positive. So this is why the lottery is a thing, right? This is why people buy loot boxes, because every human being thinks that they are better than average. This is factually incorrect. So factually, like, you know that you're not going to win the lottery. There's no point in buying loot boxes. But we each have this intrinsic bias that thinks, even though it doesn't work for other people, I'm a winner. Everybody else who buys lottery tickets is a loser, but I'm a winner. And the problem is that this level of narcissistic idiocy is required for healthy human functioning. This cognitive distortion that the world is a better place than it actually is required for the maintenance of a healthy mind. And so the problem with depressive realism is, once we remove that bias and we actually see the world more accurately, which studies will show that they actually are accurate with the way they judge things. But this, even though it's more accurate, it is not, it doesn't view the world in a way that makes us healthy. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but technically depressed people, if you're depressed, you're like actually right about the way that you see things in a lot of ways. These cognitive biases are still at play. So you actually are a better judge of the world, not actually about yourself, because all of these cognitive biases will lead to an amplification of the negative. But technically, and we're trying to be precise here, technically depressed people are more accurate judges. That doesn't mean that there aren't distortions as well. And this is just one thing that I had to include for the sake of completeness. From a very practical sense, though, we know that if you want a healthy mind, you should change your perception. And this is where my experiences with yoga and stuff are that as I see the world more clearly, as I strengthen my perception, everything does get better, but I don't think that I'm cognitively distorted, because even once you do pratyahara a lot, like, you're just going to see the world as it is. It's neither good nor bad. It is just what it is. Anyway, I know it's kind of an aside. I know it's kind of like after the fact, but for all the depressed people out there who really believe that the glass is half empty, y'all are actually not wrong.